Session for this evening's meeting. Councillors, are there any questions on item 8.1, the minutes of the council meeting of the 22nd of September? Or item 8.2, the minutes of the Policy and Legislation Committee meeting, also held on the 22nd of September? No questions? Councillors, are there any questions on any of the items in the adoption by exception resolution which contains the committee recommendations for item 12.3 and the officer recommendations for items 14.1, 16.1 and 17.1? No questions. Item 12.1 requires an absolute majority. Are there any questions on item, 12.2? Policy and Legislation Committee report. No questions. Item 15.1, disclosure of interest impartiality has been received from Councillor Barrett-Leonard. Are there any questions on item 15.1? Item 20.1, councillors, is a confidential item. If there are any questions, we will be required to go behind closed doors. No questions. Item 12.1, alternative recommendation by Councillor Payne, which will be considered after the committee recommendation. Should it lapse? Any questions to Councillor Payne? The chair of the committee, Councillor Payne. So the only change to that is the change to the minimum age, which wasn't picked up in the original alternative recommendation. Is that correct, Councillor Payne?
The difference between this and the committee recommendation is the change from 10 to 12. The 12 was present in the officer recommendation that went to the committee.
Thank you. Further questions? Item 13.1 is Amendment 50 to LPS 21. Consideration for adoption for final approval. An alternative recommendation that I understand differs from that which we have distributed. Are we able to get a written copy distributed of the alternative? It has been circulated by email prior to the meeting starting.
Sure we can.
Yeah.
Is that, these guys going to sort that out? Is that okay? Or do you want me to do it?
Councillors, are there any questions on the alternative recommendation? Councillor Payne.
Thanks. So from the document that was circulated recently, if R60 is removed from modification 2, then the prevailing height limit clause would be the 481. Let me just check that. Hang on. 481. Is that correct?
Effectively, an application would need to be assessed in the context of both sets of controls. So there would be.
So the conflict remains.
Well, yes, yeah, that's right. The inconsistency between the two remains. The degree to which there's an inconsistency does depend on exactly the interpretation of the existing scheme, but yeah, no, an inconsistency would prevail. But it would mean that there would be, if the reference to R60 is removed from item 2 in the schedule of modifications, it would mean that there would be discretion would be required for a building more than 2 stories or 9 metres tall in the locations closest to the coast.
That discretion would come from the 481 being applied discretionarily. That is discretion over that 481 condition. Because the 9 metres comes from 481.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
Right. So if the minister was of a mind to attempt to resolve that conflict for us by modifying 481,
Yep.
then our next step is to abandon the whole process or agree.
No, if the minister was of a view that the inconsistency should be resolved through this amendment, then that's the decision that the minister would make. With the way that the alternative recommendation has been drafted, both as published and as may now be proposed in slightly modified form, before the Mayor and the CEO could execute the amendment documents, a report would come back to the council. On our reading of the legislation, the city couldn't actually stop the minister from gazetting the amendment in Parliament. It would just slow it down and provide some opportunity for advocacy. And potentially another member of the Parliament could move a disallowance motion. You can probably draw your own conclusions on whether that would be supported or not. But if it was to be supported, it would mean that the amendment would be disallowed and none of the content of the amendment would end up reflected in our planning scheme, including the recoding. So you'd lose the whole of the amendment, not just the modifications.
Thanks.
Councillors, you just had distributed an amendment to the alternative recommendation from Councillor Riccelli, which is hot off the press, following on from some earlier discussion. Councillor Riccelli, did you wish to?
Yeah, sorry, yeah, just I just had a quick read of it. So yes, I'm happy with that. And I suppose for benefit of those in the gallery that might be here to speak, we have had an in-depth discussion around this and tried to reach some sort of clarification and understanding. So there is a very late amendments to my alternative motion. Thank you.
So I assume you're foreshadowing moving this now as your alternative. Thank you, Councillor Riccelli. Are there any further questions? The alternative in 13.1. Councillor Riccelli's.
Through you, Mr Mayor, to the Director. If the officer's recommendation was to proceed, hypothetically, you want to make some adjustments to the wording in that too, given there's an error?
I don't know that we would need to, Mr CEO. I think it's the kind of drafting error that would get resolved through the process fairly successfully.
No further questions? Item 13.2, amendment number 40, consideration for final adoption. Page 163 of your agenda, the alternative recommendation as displayed from Councillor Riccelli to defer this item until the 24th of November, not the 10th of November, so that has been amended on advice to prepare for an amended report, should that be necessary. Are there any questions, that alternative recommendation? If that is not supported, there is an amended recommendation from officers, also for item 13.2, which includes some modification. Councillor Payne?
Thanks. The change by officers in red, if a similar additional use was sought in the future for an unforeseen similar situation, how long does it take if it's not bundled in with this now?
I guess it would depend on how it arose. If it arose in a similar way to this through a related amendment, then it could be done fairly quickly. But if it was done as a standalone amendment, it would be a 9-month process. Typically, it just depends on workloads and complexity. 9 to 12 months is typically what we say for a relatively simple amendment.
Can I go again? Can that run in parallel with the development application process if you were going through that, so that you don't, it's not 9 months plus your development application process from the lodgement of the DA, or does it have to be one and then the other?
Well, it rather depends what you're doing, but if you're making, if what's being affected is a change of use, and what's being proposed is a change of use, and the amendment is to change that use from a prohibited use to a P or permitted use, then in most circumstances, no development application would be required. So in essence, upon gazettal of an amendment, no DA is required. Prior to gazettal, a DA couldn't even be granted.
So that's for these particular units. Did you look throughout the scheme to see if there was other in these zones that are similarly affected?
The situation where you've got such small premises with, in the main, such poor exposure, doesn't arise in that service commercial precinct elsewhere from what I can see. The other context, and it's mentioned in a comment where we did identify something similar in the past, and it wasn't, the issue there wasn't so much with exposure, but it was with the size of the premises, is Enterprise Park in Dunsborough, where you've got some 50 square metre upstairs units that originally were built, and they were only allowed to be basically factories and showrooms. And I think everyone can probably agree that that's an office, a 50 square metre upstairs premises. And it was a number of years ago now that we made a change to allow office uses in those. So in the main other example that, the other example of where that kind of situation occurs, small premises, clearly not suited to showroom or industrial uses, the council's already made the change to allow office uses. I think one of the, that has actually contributed to some parking supply issues in that area, but one of the things, the key things that's in the officer comment is that offices do typically generate more parking demand, often substantially more parking demand than showroom premises will. In terms of parking supply demand in a particular area, allowing a small number of small premises to have a change of use, the risks are relatively low, but a fairly wide-scale shift of use from showroom to office. If you get particular kinds of office uses, and once you've said offices are allowed, you've got no control over what kind of office use it is, you could end up with a lot more demand for car parking than the supply that you've actually got in place, which could affect other businesses in the precinct and certainly create some, conflict over those sorts of issues. So that's why I think that at some point a broader, more strategic look at this precinct may well make sense. But to do more than what's recommended here as an ad hoc change certainly carries some risks, but city officers were understanding and quite sympathetic to the arguments that were put by Mrs. Carroll last week, which is why we've pulled the item to make this modification, accepting it may be deferred anyway, but obviously we can't assume that it will be deferred until the meeting's actually occurred.
Thank you. And if it were to be deferred and potential other business owners did come forward who were in a similar situation and hadn't been foreseen by this, there could be an amendment at that time.
Yes.
Councillor Richard?
I think you've actually asked the question I was going to ask. So yes, I just wanted to know if there had been any other, so obviously there haven't been any other businesses that have specified, and if there were, you'd be open to obviously amending that as well, assuming it's deferred.
Yeah, I think it's probably worth clarifying. The officer recommendation is not specific to one premises. It's one lot, which I think contains 4 or 5 premises. And
Hasn't been anyone else?
I couldn't say for sure. There's been a few emails flying around and I haven't managed to keep up with all of them, Councillor Riccelli.
Any further questions, councillors? Item 13.2. Councillors, you indicated there weren't questions on item 20, the confidential item. If there are questions, we will require to close the meeting. In reflection, are there any questions you would like to ask on any of the items on this evening's agenda? Not, I will declare closed the agenda briefing session. We'll reconvene at 5:30. Councillors, staff, members of the public, I declare open this meeting of council. I acknowledge the Wardandi people as the traditional custodians of the land on which we live, work and meet. Welcome visitors and advise that the meeting is being live streamed and recorded for the purpose of minute taking. We have a full attendance of councillors. Prayer this evening is to be delivered by Pastor Paul Collier of the Busselton Baptist Church. We welcome you along, Paul, and thank you for your time and your blessing at the beginning of our meeting this evening. If you would like to come forward to, not sure if this is your first time with us, Paul? Yeah. Just right there, here.
Do I sit or stand?
Oh, you can sit. Thank you.
Cool. Right, thank you. Let me just start with a short scripture and then I'll pray. It says, do nothing out of selfish ambition. This is from Philippians 2. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who being in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in the appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. If I can pray. Lord Jesus Christ, I bring these men and women before you, whom you have given the privilege of serving this community of Busselton. I pray that they will be selfless like you. I pray they will have humility like you. I pray they will be servants of this town and seek the good of this town as you sought our good by laying down your life on a cross for our sin. I pray that as they meet tonight and deliberate and make decisions that impact the lives of people of Busselton, that they will only desire what is good and right and just and fair. I pray these councillors will listen well to one another, open to be corrected. I pray they will be quick to listen and slow to speak. I pray their time together will be marked by gentleness and self-control and goodness. And Lord Jesus, I don't know where these men and women stand in relationship with you, but I would pray that they would have an ultimate desire to know you and come to trust in you, because you are the selfless, humble servant king who died for us and rose from the dead. These things I ask in your name. Amen.
Thank you, Paul, for your time and your blessing this evening, and we, of course, welcome you to stay for the remainder of the meeting, but we do understand if you need to leave. I have not received any applications for leave of absence. Are there any leave of absence from councillors? Requests for? No. Councillor Barrett-Leonard has declared an impartiality interest in relation to item 15.1, and we'll read that out immediately prior to consideration of that item. It's now time for announcements of the presiding member, and we'll deviate slightly from the script this evening. We have two councillors who are not seeking re-election and are retiring at the end of their terms, and I will invite them to speak for a couple of minutes, should they so desire, as this will be their last meeting of council. Councillor Hick.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor, and thank you for the opportunity to speak very briefly. Certainly it wasn't an easy decision not to seek re-election. It's been quite the journey the last 4 years. Firstly, I'd like to say that it's been an absolute honour and privilege to be elected by the community and to serve that community the last 4 years. I have been so honoured to meet so many amazing people, community groups, individuals, and also with the surrounding districts as well. So that has been wonderful, and I hope to continue many of those relationships that I have formed over these last 4 years. I also wanted to say that it has been, in terms of the 4 years, as I've mentioned, quite the journey, lots of achievements. I really do think Council has worked very hard, the officers have worked very hard in the last 4 years, and there is much to show for it. Of course, there is more to be done, but I think we are on a very good track, and I fervently hope all of those gains and the work that has come before us as council members and the work that will go after us continues to be so strong and so identifiable in terms of what we are achieving. So I wish everyone the very best for that. I was wanting to make an absolute huge thank you to just a couple of quick groups. Firstly, I wanted to thank the CEO, Mike Archer, his directors, managers, officers, the greater staff of the City of Busselton. They are a really amazing group of people. They are professionally and personally some of the most wonderful people I've worked with and some of the most professional people I've worked with. And for that, I thank you all very much for your huge work, your huge assistance and your wise counsel to myself as a councillor and deputy mayor, and also to my fellow council members, of course to my retiring colleague, Councillor Lyndon Miles, who I came on with back in 2017. Seems to have gone very quickly. But to the council before us and now the council of the last 2 years, I thank you all. The greatest thing I would say, we are a group that has, you know, often very diverse opinions. That's the beauty of why we are councillors. But we were all very respectful of each other, and I really thank Paul for that. I think we are quick to listen, slower to talk, and really listen to other people's opinions and welcome those of the community. But what I especially like, and I applaud and I hope continues, is that whatever those differences are, we are respectful of people's opinions, we leave them in the chamber, we support the decision, and we act always in the best interests of this local government. So I wish you all very well, and I would a special thanks to the mayor as the deputy mayor. I've worked very closely with our mayor, Councillor Grant Henley. Thank you so much for your wonderful leadership to us, Grant. I really have appreciated that. I've also appreciated your wise counsel and also those opportunities to voice my opinions as we've worked closely together. I thank you. To those councillors that are standing again, I wish you all the very best and for the council going forward. Again, thank you for the opportunity to speak tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hick. Councillor Miles, did you wish to speak?
Thank you very much, Mr Mayor. I concur everything that Councillor Hick has said. As you know, I don't like standing up here to talk, so I'm going to read out what I have to say. It is with great sadness that I've had, but in the best interest of my health, that I've had to stand down from council. It has been a very huge privilege to have been elected in 2017, and I have enjoyed the challenges and opportunity to serve the community for the last 4 years. I want to thank everyone who has had faith in me to do this role for the best interests of the whole community. I want to wish all the best to the new council that is formed on Monday, and I look forward to the great work the last 2 councils that I've been on continuing. Thank you to all the staff who have supported me and advice and all that. Thank you, Mr Mayor. Thank you to the current council. Sad that I'm having to stand down, but it's been a great privilege and learning, and it's been great to represent the community and be out there. So thank you very much.
Thank you, and can I say to both Councillor Hick and Councillor Miles, thank you from the council and the community for your 4 years of service to the council. You both bring very different skill sets to the table. That's what I think makes a good council, is to have a lot of different opinions, a lot of different life experiences, and a lot of different skills that you bring to the discussion. And they are very valued and will be very sorely missed, I'm sure, in the future. But thank you for your contribution over this time, and I'm sure we'll have a more formal occasion to make a longer speech, but just thought it was important to do at this time. Thank you. We now move to question time for the public. We have a response to a previous question taken on notice from Mr. Keith Sims, in regard which the response has been provided to Mr. Sims and will also be published in the minutes. Are there any members of the public who would like to ask a question of council? Please come forward, Mr. Sims.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Mr Mayor and councillors and others, for this opportunity. Firstly, I'd just like to say thank you to the two retiring councillors for their work and effort over the last 4 years. So thank you. The recent advice that the city had received a $2 million grant is actually part of the federal government local roads community infrastructure program, phase 3, and not specifically for the BPAC project. This money could have been used on roads or other COB projects as well. The $2.5 million raised by selling the properties in Chapman Hill Road and Ambergate have been placed into a new account. First part of my question is, can you please confirm if the $2.5 million will be allocated to the BPAC project, if it goes ahead, in addition to the grant money I've already mentioned?
Mr. CEO, I think part of the resolution at last week's council was for that money to go into the new infrastructure development reserve.
That's right, Mr Mayor. It was in the new infrastructure, not the Busselton Performing Arts Reserve account.
So it won't be taken out of that fund for the BPAC?
No.
Okay, thank you.
It could be utilised by a future decision of council, but that is not the intention of the resolution at last week's meeting.
Yep, no worries, thank you. The sale of the old library, $2.6 million, has been allocated to the BPAC as well. So what other COB saleable assets does the city own?
Mr Mayor, we've got a whole portfolio of assets, but I would have to take that on notice.
I mean, this building isn't. This building is an asset, but it's not
We can't sell
saleable.
it, no,
So
yeah. But we do own freehold title land around the district.
okay,
Not a lot.
Not a lot, not a lot. Not a
Even
lot.
less now.
We own land at Port Geograph. We own land at Berryman Road.
is it a comprehensive list?
There's probably about 20 blocks,
Oh,
maybe.
yeah, it's more than I thought.
But there's no signal to sell any land.
No, there isn't. Maybe at the moment, but the Chapman Hill land
Chapman
is
Hill land was one that was identified for review.
The old library site that was sold was part of a council resolution from 2014, I think, to sell the land and for it to go into the Performing Arts Centre reserve.
Yeah, I wasn't against that as such. I was just commenting that an asset was sold and that money's gone into BPAC. The revised tenders for the BPAC have been submitted. Question, when does the city expect for the results to be coming back to council for appraisal?
When we've completed the due diligence.
But as a timeframe?
Possibly 3 weeks, 4 weeks,
Okay,
when we've completed the due diligence.
yeah. With regard to the question on notice that you said had been answered, Mr Mayor, I'd find that it wasn't fully answered to my question. So my question is, can the city please confirm that in addition to the $58 rate increase already confirmed, another $40 arising from the $1.2 million operating loss cost, making a total of $98?
Well, I think that question has been answered, and the response was around the assumptions and averages detailed in that correspondence.
No, it only said that it confirmed the $58, not the $40 from the $1.2 million operating loss of BPAC. I did reply to the
Sorry,
response.
I'm just looking into the response, but Mr. Noddle, did you wish to
Yeah, through the
respond
chair, I'm
further
just
to that?
re-looking at, sorry, I obviously got a bit confused with the questions that were being asked and thought they'd been responded to. So there was another email that Mr. Sims is referring to about confirming whether the $40, I think, is that what?
Yes.
Here. Whether that's included as well. What that is from the email sent a fair few times before, was that was what the equivalent would be if you were it was the equivalent of the operating costs of the percentage of rates.
Yeah.
So that's what it would be if you applied it to those assumptions. So I thought I'd answered that in the previous email, so I wasn't sure whether you did get that response or not. So I can respond to that, Mr. Mayor.
So the $40 is a increased cost due to the 1.2 million budgeted operating cost, making a total of $98 rate increase.
That response will be provided by Mr. Noddle.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Yep.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak, and I agree with Keith. Thank you to the retiring councillors for your service, and good luck to those other two that are standing. The city's 2020 financial report outlines 2 magistrate court prosecutions. The report says the city is prosecuting landowners for non-compliance with conditions under development approvals issued by the city. My question is, could you please advise how much the city has currently expended on the City of Busselton versus Bishop court case, approximately?
I'm not sure a decision was made in that case today. A finding.
It was, but I'm asking how much has been expended so far in taking the case to court.
I'm not sure if we have that.
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, I'd have to take that question on notice.
I
Thank you.
notice. Why did the city feel it necessary to pursue this case?
In this instance, well, it's a bit difficult to speak. There are legal questions there. I'm not really comfortable in
It was answered in court today.
those in court.
Yeah. So it's on
Then-
public record.
Then the decision to prosecute was based on previous history, on a number of complaints, on issues with compliance over a number of instances that the council determined was worthy of pursuing for prosecution.
The case was heard today, and Mr. Bishop pled guilty and was duly fined $80,000 plus court costs of $3,500 were handed down. Why did the city not pursue a fine which could have been a maximum of $200,000 and $25,000 per day for a total of 39 days, which equates to $975,000?
We took legal advice that was unlikely to be successful.
So why, if the owner of the land, Mr. Bishop, was trying to remediate his land from a previous owner's dumping, did the city not work with Mr. Bishop to assist in the remediation of his land?
I don't know that it's up to the city to remediate land.
No,
Private
Mr.
property.
Bishop was remediating the land.
That's arguable.
Well, it
Determined
came out in
court.
court today.
My understanding was the judge didn't accept that commentary by Mr. Bishop.
Okay. So I refer to the minutes of 1st of March 2016, the special meeting of electors, and my efforts to raise the awareness of increasing the building heights, and in particular 13.1 on tonight's agenda. And I note in the information provided that this matter has been to the Supreme Court. And I see another item being 13.2 also fits this category of many affected owners who do not know about this potential change, and I predict will also be lawyering up if this goes ahead. And I ask that you support Councillor Riccelli's alternative motion tonight. My question is, do you not feel that if more in-depth community consultation was conducted, then these issues could be ironed out without costing ratepayers exorbitant amounts?
I think we also always endeavour to consult with the community as broadly as possible, especially in planning amendments, and sometimes it's very difficult to get the community to come to the table until it directly impacts them or the issue is raised.
You do have the contact details of all these people that pay rates, though.
Yep. And these are advertised regularly on email and through the newspaper and through other mediums to try and get people to participate in consultation.
But you do have their email and their contact details. Surely you could contact them in different ways. No, the people that own the buildings.
And I'm pretty sure that they would have been consulted in this instance 5 years ago.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other members of the public that would like to ask a question of council? Move on. Item 8.1 is to confirm the minutes of the council meeting held on the 22nd of September. Is there a moved? Councillor Carter, seconded Councillor Hick. Is there any opposition? There's not. I'll put the motion. Those in favour is carried 9-0. Item 8.2 is to note the minutes of the Policy and Legislation Committee meeting held on the 22nd of September. Is there a mover? Moved Councillor Cox, seconded Councillor Miles. Is there any opposition? If not, I put the motion. Those in favour is carried 9-0. Now have presentations by parties with an interest. We've received 3 bookings. The first booking received is from Mr Tony Sharp, representing the Dunsborough Progress Association on item 13.1, Amendment 50 to LPS 21. Mr Sharp, if you would like to come forward, you have 5 minutes, and then councillors may wish to ask you a question.
Sorry, good evening, and thank you for your time. There seems to be some confusion in the planning department over the Dunsborough community, over what the Dunsborough community wants along the first section of Geograph Bay Road. 3 stories rather than 2 stories, or 3 stories rather than 4 stories. So a little bit of history. There was a high level of concern within the community at the end of last year when a 4-story apartment complex was proposed for construction adjacent to Seymour Park. Fearing a string of 4-story apartments, the DPA initiated a petition to reclassify the R codes from R80 to R60. It was decided to take the R60 route as it seemed less controversial and should achieve quick council support. The objective was to get it into law ASAP. I can assure you, as a collector of signatures, the concern of many was why we were not going to 2 stories in line with 150 metres from the waterline regulation, clause 4.8.1 of the planning scheme. We had to explain we needed a quick resolution. There were very, very few people who did not want to sign because they liked 4 stories. My colleagues here can vouch for that. I must admit, if we knew at the time the city had written to landowners back in 2017 when Amendment 1, which brought in the R80 zoning, was introduced, and the city promised the landowners that the 2-story limit would be enforced. In other words, the city promised that within 150 metres of the high water mark, buildings would be limited to 2 stories, i.e. the city lied to, or at least misled the landowners, then we might have taken a different approach. However, there is never any sense of the community wanting 2 stories in preference, there's never any sense of the community wanting 3 stories in preference to 2 stories. We therefore strongly urge you to reject the proposed modifications that would eliminate the possibility, or at least seems to eliminate the possibility, of the 150 rule coming into play, especially as this issue will be resolved by the Supreme Court within a month or so. Similarly, we urge you not to give the planning officials greater discretion in allowing 4 stories after the R code change takes place. Thirdly, given the fact the planning department has been against this rezoning from day one, we ask you to ensure any further changes come back to council and are not left to the discretion of planning officers. Finally, I'd like to point out the level of community feeling on this issue. The DPA quickly got over 700 signatures for the petition and could have got a great deal more if we were not in a hurry to get the document to the city. And as for the Your Say polling, all the community input was in favor of the recoding, 100%. Is that a record for Your Say? The sole negative voice was the lawyer for the developer, and even he didn't object to the other properties being recoded, just his client's property. Now, I may be wrong, but it appears from what I've seen and what you seem to have decided this afternoon, that you plan to undermine the amendment by producing modifications that are in fact a new amendment. I strongly urge you not to tamper with 4.81 until the outcome of the court case is known. Again, I ask you to drop points 2, 3, and 4. If this might cause difficulty with the WAPC, then so be it, and we address the issues at that time. By that time, we may know the status of the Supreme Court decision. Now, perhaps I have this wrong, and perhaps someone can clarify me, but that seems to be the situation right now, and it seems to be you're moving totally against the spirit of this amendment. Thank you.
Any questions of Mr. Sharp? Councillor Celli?
I'm wondering, Mr Mayor, if perhaps Mr Needham could actually respond to Mr Sharp's query regarding that, perhaps give some clarification, because I think it needs to be appreciated. Obviously, these last amendments have come through without it, anyone having a chance to dissect them.
I think the first and most important thing I'd like to note is that when this amendment was first presented to the council, city officers were not supportive of the amendment at all. The officer recommendation is now supportive of the recoding of all of the land that was intended to be subject to the amendment to R60, and is also supportive of adding in 2 further lots in the area to be recoded from R80 to R60. So assertions that city officers are somehow ignoring that feedback from the community are certainly not consistent with that change in officer recommendation from not supporting the amendment at all to supporting the amendment essentially in whole, plus adding in 2 more sites. In terms of the 2 versus 3 floors, etc., one of the stated purposes of the amendment in the reasons put by Councillor Riccelli in her notice of motion, and we need to remember that councillors are putting those motions, was a desire to certainly to limit height, and in part to not allow 4-storey buildings, and to look at a 3-storey height control. That is certainly clear. Whether it was clear from some in the community's perspective, but it's certainly clear from the commentary at that time. It has been argued in the court that, in fact, there is an absolute unvariable 2-storey height control on some of the affected land. And in our report to the council, we have indicated correctly that if the council's intent is to apply a 3-storey height control, they would need to modify the amendment to give them confidence that in fact that stated purpose of the amendment can be achieved. So it would not be reasonable for officers to bring this amendment back to the council without recommending some change of that kind. The council can decide whether they pursue that or not. The other issue that is most critical in terms of modifications to the amendment is that we have for well over a decade, well prior to my time working with the city, I've been here nearly 13 years, operating on the basis that the 2-storey height control along Geograph Bay Road, which at one point was actually 7.5 metres, not 9 metres, is not an absolute unvariable control. It is something that's subject of reasonable discretion. Particularly when that was a 7.5 metre control, a very large proportion of the newer houses along Geograph Bay Road that have been built within the last decade or so could not have been built in the form in which they have been built. And I don't know that many people would argue that they're unreasonable in terms of height. So changes to clarify that situation, again, have been identified as being possible and reasonably related to the amendment. The final point I'd make is in relation to the current clause in the scheme says there's a height control. It doesn't say where you measure height from. It doesn't say that the starting point for the measurement of height is natural ground level, which is the normal approach and is the approach that we've applied in practice. If we were to find ourselves in a situation in November or December or whenever a decision is handed down, that we have an absolute unvariable height control but do not know the basis on which we're measuring height, it would leave the city in a very, very difficult situation. And certainly it would be unreasonable were that to arise for officers not to bring a report to the council to say we need to address that situation of uncertainty, because it leaves, depending on exactly what might come out of a decision, if the Supreme Court action is successful, it could leave us in a situation where we don't have clarity around what are the height controls that relate to most of the land in the district. So again, it would have been unreasonable for city officers to bring this amendment back to the council without identifying that issue and identifying means by which it could be addressed.
Can I comment? Well, it's great that the planners are now on board with the amendment. So it's just unfortunate that you're undermining what the whole spirit of the amendment is about. To say that because of this amendment, we want to rule out 2-storey is totally counter to the spirit of this amendment. And if it turns out that the court case makes it clear that 2-storey regulation is valid, well, so be it. That's the preference of the community, and that is the rule that's out there now, which should be enforced and hasn't been enforced. In terms of the high water mark, we seem to have been able to live with that quite well for the last few years. And if it is crucial, then that should be brought in perhaps as a separate amendment. But to bring this in now, when there is a court case underway, a decision is being made, which will totally undermine the outcome of that court case, is just, and which flies totally against what the community wants, is just incredibly disappointing. Well, it's more than disappointing, but we'll leave it at disappointing. So again, I would strongly urge you to drop 2, 3, and 4, and if they need to be addressed, they be addressed as a separate amendment brought in by the city. But right now, I think we should just focus on getting that R60 coding changed. Thank you.
Sorry, Mr. Shutt, you're suggesting 2, 3 and 4 in attachment E to the agenda?
That's right. And and 5 being modified as recommended in the other amendment, basically, that any changes mandated by the WAPC goes back to council for discretion, for decision, and not left to discretion of the planning officers.
I think some of those points are included in.
Yes, they are. They are.
Councillor Payne, you have a question?
Can I just clarify something? You said the mean high water mark has been working. That's not the one that is clearly defined in the scheme. It's the height going upwards.
Yes.
From nowhere at the moment, but going to ground level.
Right.
The 150 metre one, that's fine. We know where that is.
And I'm not all that hung up about that height issue, but it just seems that we're tagging it on to something else. And there is, I'm arguing focus should be on the outcome of the rezoning, and if there are other things that need to be done, they be addressed elsewhere in a separate amendment. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Yes, it's probably more for Mr Meadham, but Mr Sharp's suggestion, and we obviously touched on this earlier as well. What are your thoughts around putting a separate amendment through for 2, 3 and 4?
Look, if the council doesn't include those modifications, and if the Supreme Court action is successful, then certainly some of what is recommended, in fact, probably, I'm thinking as I'm going, effectively all of what is in 2, 3 and 4, bar the reference to R80 or R60, would be necessary to avoid a situation where we had an absolute unvariable height control from a base that's not defined, and a situation where essentially houses built along Geograph Bay Road, houses, not apartments, would have to be designed to achieve an arbitrary height level. Councillors and some members of the community may be aware that a recent Supreme Court decision has created a situation of this kind in Yallingup, where we have a height control, and the court has interpreted, contrary to advice and practice over a very long period of time, that the height control is unvariable. So what we now have is people designing houses that are just designed to get under the height control, and in terms of the actual impacts that they have on people, in some cases they're actually having more impact than they would have had there been some greater discretion.
Oh, sorry. Through the Mayor, can I ask a secondary question, please? Oh, sorry.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr Sharp. I just wanted to clarify how you feel that what is in effect, as Mr Needham's explained in relation to 2, 3 and 4, I totally understand what's trying to be achieved here, both community and with Councillor Richelli's foreshadowed alternate motion. I guess I'm just wondering why, if the modifications as we've had them explained in 2, 3 and 4, where, as I see, they are policy neutral in many respects. They are just clarifying things or giving some certainty around other things. They're not creating something that wasn't there before. I guess I'm struggling with why you believe that it would undermine the amendment, because really they are, cleaning up certain things that probably need a bit of a look at. And as it relates to give clarity to the area, the subject of this amendment and beyond, but particularly taking this opportunity, and you've heard how long the amendments take, as you would rightly know, the 9 months, etc. But I guess I just wanted to understand that a little better, if you could just
Sure.
explain that.
On two instances, my understanding, and I may be wrong, is that if these amendments pass, then in this area, that 150-meter rule does not apply. And currently, it's up to debate whether it applies or not. And so to rule it out when a decision is being made by the court seems to me preemptive and against the spirit of what this is trying to achieve. And the other aspect of it is the discretion in terms of the R codes. And frankly, we've seen so often, every time basically, well, effectively every time, discretion is shown, it's shown to be higher. And excuse me if I'm cynical, but I can't help think that we'll be back here at a JDAT meeting within 2 years or less, and the planning authorities will be arguing that this building justifies 4 stories, even though it's in the R60 because of whatever argument they want to produce. So it's on those two bases, and it may be clarifying, but it's clarifying in the wrong direction as far as the community is concerned. Now that height level, maybe that is something that needs to be addressed now, and maybe that's something that can be added in somewhere along the line, because that seems to be a neutral issue. But ruling out the 150-meter rule is certainly not neutral.
Okay, I've got to try and word this as a question. So my question is, my understanding is that by deleting the R80 and the R60 in item 2, still allows for that high water mark rule. Is there anything else within 2, 3 and 4 that you believe would undermine the utilisation of that high water mark regulation?
No, and certainly when the modifications were drafted, with the exception of the reference to R80 or R60, the brief, if you like, to our internal legal was that it should be policy neutral in terms of the outcome. So that was the intent. To enable, in part, the council to determine whether it wanted to resolve the inconsistency between the two sets of height controls through this amendment. So that was the brief. That's the thinking behind it. So if in item 2, reference to R80 or R60, so adding that into that clause, which already exempts the RAC3 coded area from the area the normal height controls, if you like. If that modification isn't made by the council, our understanding is that it's policy neutral in terms of the matters that are subject of the current Supreme Court proceedings, which are fundamentally around there is certainly an inconsistency between 4.8.1 and 4.3.2. There's no question about that, and that case is around how that inconsistency should be resolved. What is the answer given, in terms of what's allowed in terms of development? So, certainly the intent in drafting the report was to enable the council to have a fairly sort of crisp, clear decision in terms of whether they resolve that inconsistency or not. And by removing reference to R80 or R60, you can not resolve the inconsistency.
That inconsistency there. There is nothing else that would affect that in those recommendations.
No, so the brief very much in terms of internal legal to draft the the modifications was to avoid, those things don't affect the policy question that we're talking about.
Councillor Carter?
Yeah, Mr. Nadeem, under Amendment 4, I suppose being a councillor and the issue comes back to council, you'll be sympathetic to the community's wishes. But say in that situation it goes to JDAP, as happened in the case that we've been recently talking about, and where does that? How can we have comfort that they're not going to just exceed the maximum height limits in that situation? And how high could they go?
Yeah. So there are very, very few development standards. So this height control is what planners will often refer to as a development standard. A setback or a height control is a development standard. In the city's planning scheme, as in nearly every other planning scheme, there's what's called a variations clause. And it says that development standards can, in certain circumstances, be varied. Where development is subject to the R code, so residential development, it also sets out the equivalent of development standards and provides a basis to depart from those standards. It is about reasonable discretion of the decision maker. That is the case. It doesn't matter whether it's a setback control, a height control here, a height control in just about anywhere across the state. So if, however, the Supreme Court action currently underway is successful, then that would create a situation where that particular development standard, the height one, could not be varied. So there was no discretion. Yeah. But I can give you no more, if the Supreme Court action is unsuccessful, I can give you no more comfort around that standard will never be varied than I can any other standard across the city. And I know that there's some people who have views that this is not the way the planning system should work, but it is very much the way that the planning system does work. And it's been the direction of planning reform over certainly the whole of the course of my career, away from inflexible arbitrary standards and towards more performance-based approaches to planning.
No further questions. Thank you, Mr. Sharp.
Thank you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. The next booking we've received is from Mr. Paul Kotsoglo in relation to item 13.2, Amendment 40, consideration for final adoption, and also Mr. Jim Lightus, who's here. Welcome, gentlemen.
Mr Mayor, councillors, people in the gallery, thank you for the opportunity to speak and to have been heard last week. Importantly, I mentioned that Mr Ersic is interstate and Philippa Kelly, the CEO of the LFRA, who is also a client represented by our organisation, is regrettably in lockdown in Melbourne. So we're delighted to be here tonight. Thank you. I've got Mr Lightus here because he's the substantial investor in a number of projects in the city, both in town centres and in centres that are not within the CBD areas. He'll say a couple of words, but I'd like to make a few points prior to that, if I may. First of all, I've circulated the briefing note and I expect that's been received by councillors and officers, and that happened yesterday. In summary, what I'd like to say is this proposal takes P uses which are certain and permitted, certainly permitted, and makes them either D uses, discretionary, or ex-uses. That is, it makes them uncertain or certainly not permitted. That's changing the rules. Those changes have substantial economic impacts. They also have substantial employment and social impacts. The changes will lock in a series of uses that either become non-conforming uses, and therefore those uses will be prohibited from receiving investment and upgrading the facilities over time. The areas will become blighted, or those tenancies will become blighted as a direct result, and areas will be held back. Now, this was intended, as I understood the reading of the documents, to say this amendment was to enhance the CBD, to ensure the CBD had an opportunity to succeed. I don't think that that set of modifications in the recommendation does that. I'll also say this is, in my view, not a standard amendment. And if you go to Roman numeral, number 6, Roman numeral 2, item 3, the term I used earlier about being significant economic and social impacts defines as a result that this use of this amendment shouldn't be classified as standard amendment, but rather a complex one. So it's gone through a different process than I say that it should have. Now, there's good reason for that, but I don't agree. I've explained that position. You've got the document that you've received from us. We'd ask you to reject the amendment. And Mr. Leaders is here.
Excuse me, Mr. Soglio, did that go to all councillors?
I received
Oh, it's from someone else, is it?
it came from Jonathan Cohen.
Jonathan Cohen.
It was sent to all councillors yesterday.
And there's an attachment to that, or an appendix, alternate recommendation appendix 2, which we're asking that the council adopt, which is effectively the rejection of that amendment. Councillor Carter. I've asked today for Mr. Leaders to join me to be very simple about this. He invests around the country. He's invested substantially here, has family assets and business assets in your jurisdiction. And if he could speak, I'd be grateful. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome
Thank
along.
you. So just going back, we bought the Homemaker Centre, I'm guessing 15 odd years ago. We bought it from a developer. It was, they used to call them bulky goods centres then. The definition now is large format. So we bought that as a product. It was we knew what we bought. We bought a bulky goods centre which was had a Bunnings and a whole bunch of other stores that were large format, as they call them now. So as Paul said, changing the rules after you've bought something isn't the right way to do things. People want to buy with certainty. Just recently, we spent about $5 million extending the Bunnings store. So we've gone and spent more money. We want certainty. When I read the original definition, this thing, domestic hardware, which has since been clarified, I understand the difference. But domestic hardware then, when you go to like these you put these sorts of words in, domestic hardware, sounds like it means knives and forks. That's what it sounds like to me when you read following through. Now, there are certain tenants which want to be adjoining a Bunnings. So one of them is Kitchen Warehouse. Let's just use them as an example. They sell knives and forks, they sell crockery, they sell glasses. Now, by this definition, those guys, they might get a gig in here, they may not. You may say, no, their business is selling knives and forks, but they sell everything. You go into the store, they sell a whole multitude of things. They sell coffee machines, they sell lots of different things. So we say that there also, that Paul didn't mention, which is pertinent, is that the large format, there's a group of, there's this association, there's probably about 50 members of this association Australia-wide. We own a lot of large format centres, and there's been they've been trying to get, and they've been successful, to get standardised definitions of what large format is so that everybody can go in with confidence, so that people don't invest money into an expensive fit-out. Some of these fit-outs might be $1 million. So they invest $1 million on a fit-out and then their lease expires and they say, oh, well, you know, you're out because you don't comply anymore. So the association has been pushing Australia-wide to get everybody in every state to agree on what a large format centre is defined by. Now, Paul tells me that the state government is on board on that. So why would Busselton want to go its own race? Why doesn't Busselton get on with everybody else around the country who are going to define what a large format centre is, which this clearly is a large format centre. So just let me look at my notes if there's anything else. And look, and if any of these people are looking, some of these people want 1,000, 1,500 metres of shop front. Well, where are they going to go in Busselton to find 1,500 metres? You've got to find a piece of land, then you've got to build it, provide the parking. This is already existing. Why would you not encourage people to use this facility for the purpose that it's been designed? I think that's about all I've got to say. I think I've covered everything, unless Paul wants to say something to wrap up.
We'd just like to say thank you, Mr Mayor. We have asked that the item be rejected. We did outline the confusion around some of the definitions, and that if the elected members were not fully familiar with the detail, at the very least to defer it. So we thank you for the opportunity, and I'll resume my seat in the gallery unless you wanted me to answer any questions, sir.
I can advise that a motion to defer has been foreshadowed by a councillor in recognition of some of those issues that you've outlined.
Thank you.
Councillor Payne, you had a question?
I have a question for Mr. Kotsoglu. Sorry, I'm a bit thirsty. So in the briefing note from yesterday, it has on page 3, the third paragraph down, it talks about limiting retailers requiring a relatively small floor space for display purposes, where the majority of stock is held off-site and delivered direct to customers.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just going to the...
Page 3, paragraph 3.
Yes?
Yep. So why should that be a why should that be a bulky good when it doesn't require access by vehicles, they're being directly delivered to customers, and what so it's a list of things that are being displayed in a small area.
Well, I understand your question. The paragraph reads, it also limits innovation by retailers requiring a relatively small space for display where the majority of stock is held off-site and delivered direct to customers. Retailers operate with comparison shopping where the like premises are co-located with other like retailers, and therefore in this arrangement essentially could be expected for tenants to move from time to time to innovate their methods of displaying their business. We're saying that this is not going to be permitted under the changes that are proposed.
Yeah, and my question is, why should it be? If it's
Why should it be?
If it sells sporting goods, right, something from part A, but it requires a small area of space and you don't need access to buy a car, why is it why should it be in a bulky goods precinct?
The outcome that we would say, we say that you need, you don't necessarily need a limit, because you are able and you should be able to innovate in terms of the compliance with the planning scheme. You should be able to innovate and adapt your retailing requirements to present your goods to the public in a way that might suit the market trends. What I understood this to be doing is limiting the options that are available to the community of retailers.
It's only limiting it in the bulky goods, the service commercial area for bulky goods. It's not prohibiting it in retail.
You've
It's
got,
that innovation
you've got
is
a
still able
change
to
of
occur.
15. If you go, while we're reading the submission that we presented, if you go to page 2, what it is doing, what this amendment does in undermining investment into Busselton, in the middle of that, in page 2, the proposal is to prohibit 15 use classes in the service commercial zone and 6 use classes in the light industry zone. So it's not, Councillor Payne, it's not just one particular issue we're concerned about. I acknowledged last week when Mr Needham pointed out that there were changes that were incorporated as a result of submissions. But we say those changes are tweaking at the edges. There are substantial changes. When you go through that table, and Mr Leaders' staff are there trying to lease a premises out on Strelly Street that were once permitted, that now either become discretionary or not permitted, that's the problem. The certainty goes away from this. So there are components of this where, yeah, look, we probably live with, but there are parts that make it absolutely fatal to the investments that have been presented. So I think I understand the question. Kotsoglo, you're getting tied up about one aspect that really isn't here or there. It's not the point. The point is that there are 15 changes to uses that were once permitted that are no longer permitted. There are changes in this document that ultimately present to the landowners and the community to change what's allowed, and that's the problem. Sorry, I can't hear.
Councillor Payne, if you are speaking, you need to use your microphone for the benefit of those listening. No? Are there any further questions, councillors, of the Mr Lightis or Mr Kotsoglo? No, thank you.
Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Councillors, the adoption by exception resolution contains the committee recommendation for item 12.3 and the officer recommendations for items 14.1, 16.1 and 17.1. Is there a mover for the en bloc resolution? Moved Councillor Cronin, seconded Councillor Barrett-Leonard. Is there any opposition? It's not. I put the motion. Those in favour? It's carried 9-0. Item 12.2, Policy and Legislation Committee Annual Statutory Review of Delegations of Authority. Requires an absolute majority. Is there a mover for the committee recommendation? Moved Councillor Barrett-Leonard, seconded Councillor Carter. Is there any opposition? Not. I put the motion. Those in favour? It's carried 9-0, absolute majority achieved. Item 15.1, Councillor Barrett-Leonard, do you have a disclosure?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I declare an impartiality interest in item 15.1, Marketing and Events Referent Group Outcomes, as I am a board member of the Busselton Chamber of Commerce, which is one of the recommended recipients of funding. As a consequence, there may be a perception that my impartiality on the matter may be affected, and I declare that I will consider the item solely on its merits and vote or act accordingly.
Thank you, Councillor Barrett-Leonard. Is there a mover for the officer recommendation, item 15.1? Move Councillor Hick, seconded Councillor Cronin. Is there any opposition? If not, I put the motion. Those in favour? It's carried 9-0. Can't consider item 20 yet. No. Item 12.1. We need to consider the committee recommendation in the first instance. Is there a mover for the committee recommendation? There's not. Is there a mover for the alternative recommendation from Councillor Payne? Oh, you do have to move it. I do apologise. Would you like to put your alternative recommendation, Councillor Payne?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I will move my alternative recommendation as written. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there a seconder? There is. Is there any opposition? It's not. I put the motion. Those in favour? It's carried 9-0. Item 13.1, alternative recommendation. Councillor Riccelli, would you like to?
Just to throw another spanner in the works, Mr Mayor. Obviously the last alternate motion has just come through. I would like to make some changes to the last alternate motion, and I guess I need some guidance as to whether I can make some amendments to my original one and have that heard first, or whether I need to foreshadow and be heard after the officers. If it will be heard after the officers, then I'll need to move my first motion as is.
Councillor Riccelli, is your changes to your alternative substantial?
Yes. I'm happy to share what they will be.
Perhaps it might help in determining.
Basically, the changes will be, everything remains as is, except under 1A, it'll be deletion of item 2, and under 1C, it'll be deletion of item 4. Everything else would remain as is written.
I think that is substantial. Mr Needham, as the author of the officer's report, you...
I'm not the resident expert on standing orders, I'm afraid, in terms of determining.
Does it substantially affect the...
No, it probably. I don't know that it does, because I think that what's left, or no, what would not occur, is the updating of references to the contemporary versions of the codes. Yeah, I think on that basis, I'd probably say it's not particularly substantial. Yeah.
Thank you for that advice, Mr Needham. In that case, I will allow Councillor Riccelli to move her amended alternative recommendation, and if that is unsuccessful, then the officer's recommendation will be considered.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I'm assuming I will have to read the whole lot out, given I can't say it's as written.
I think just the changes to your distributed latest amendment.
Yes, I'd like to move my alternate motion with changes to 1A to read deletion of item 2 and changes to 1C reading deletion of item 4. Everything else remains as written.
And B remaining, oh, that was a typo? Yep, okay. Yeah,
I'm happy for
can you confirm what is on the screen are the changes that you wish to move?
That's correct.
Thank you. Is there If you have a question, use your microphone, please, Councillor Crane.
Only that C has now been deleted. That was all, or is no longer option C. That's all. C becomes.
So C remains. Yeah, thank you. Is there a seconder for Councillor Riccielli's? I'll second Councillor Riccielli's alternative. If you'd like to speak to it, Councillor Riccielli.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Yeah, obviously this has gone back and forth quite a bit. My reasons for putting forward this alternate motion is that the proposed clarification to the wording in the scheme sought by the officers, while it's understood, there does need to be some clarification, and there's obviously a lot of inconsistency. I am concerned that it is inconsistent with the actual desired community objectives, in particular around modifications 2 and 4. I'm concerned that it removes the possibility that the application of clause 4.3.2 of the scheme can come into effect, thereby preventing the use of the R codes under clause 4.8.3 to allow 3 to 4 storey developments on land within 150 metres of the high water mark, except as already identified in the area zoned RAC3. What does need to be understood, and what Mr Sharp has clearly identified, is that the community, whilst they submitted a petition to limit the height of buildings along the foreshore from 4 storeys to 3 storeys, their response was primarily due to the urgency to address the proposed 4-storey DA and the planning officer's decision to use their discretion to not prioritise the 150-metre high water line regulation. But in reality, the community would actually prefer any future foreshore building not to exceed 2 storeys. The difficulty is that in reality, even changing to an R60, there will still be discretion to approve buildings taller than a regular 3-storey. And on the other hand, if we were to use the clause as it stands regarding the 150-metre high water mark, it probably affects half of the current 2-storey houses along Geograph Bay Road. It's a really tricky road to navigate, to be honest, but we do need to try to limit these heights, respect what the community have asked for, and to try and limit the discretion with all respect to the officers as much as we possibly can within this very complicated planning framework. My alternative recommendation seeks to ensure that no specific modifications to the current conflicting regulations between the R codes and the high water distance mark occurs until the results of the Supreme Court case are known. This should govern our decision-making basis around these modifications. It also seeks to ensure that any further modifications surrounding this matter come back formally through Council for discussion and determination. I encourage you to support these recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Riccielli. I'll reserve my right as the seconder. Is there a speaker against the alternative recommendation? Councillor Barrett-Lim.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Not against so much, but a foreshadowing a motion to defer this until the 27th of October.
Thank you. Should the motion be unsuccessful, you may move that following the... Well, that's a procedural motion to defer. Is it procedural? Sorry, one moment. Procedural motion.
Excuse me, Mr Mayor, if we are going to defer it, would it be appropriate to defer it a little bit longer to allow potentially new councillors the time to get their head around it? Because I'm having enough of a struggle getting my head around it as it is, and I've been on council for quite a long period of time.
Can I just, clarify, Mr Mayor, are you looking to defer the whole amendment or just the modifications? Because there is concern around deferring the whole amendment. I just need some clarification on what you're actually suggesting, sorry.
Your question is around, the motion you're foreshadowing is to defer, which is a procedural motion which can be moved now.
Do I need to give reasons for?
You can give reasons, but we'll need a seconder for that procedural motion. Just, Mr. Needham, if I could ask a question. What, if any, is the impact on the process of the amendment, which is already a seriously entertained document in the planning parlance?
We're already past the point where we should have actually made a recommendation to the Commission, I think, or we're very, very close to that. And the way the regulations work, if the council hasn't made a recommendation to the Commission before that date, then the Commission can make a recommendation to the Minister without a recommendation from the council. I think it's fairly unlikely that they would do that. While I've got the opportunity, I should just clarify, you can't separate the modifications from your recommendation on the amendment. So you either deal with it in toto this evening or defer it entirely.
In total,
yeah.
Thank you.
And just as information, obviously, a deferral would defer a ministerial decision and the amendment.
By an equal amount of time. Thank you. Councillor Barrett-Leonard, with that information, would you still like to move your procedural motion?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, I would, mainly because in the last, 4 hours this afternoon, we've had 4 changes to this, and I just want to tidy it all up and have more clarification of what we're exactly what we're doing, because we need to get this right.
Yeah, sorry, you just need to move your procedural motion, not
I would like
outline your
I'd
reasons.
like to move a motion that we defer item 13.1 until the 27th of October, which is the next ordinary council meeting, with the clarifications.
Is there a seconder for that procedural motion? There is a seconder. There is no debate. There is no debate on the procedural motion.
Not until there has been a seconder.
There is a seconder.
There is a seconder, so now the debate will not open until there is a seconder, so there can be
Yeah,
debate.
so there is a seconder. Yeah. Did you wish to speak to your procedural motion, Councillor Barrett-Leonard? Yeah, it's been seconded. Yeah, so that's why I just invited. Councillor Barrett-Leonard, you may speak to your procedural motion.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think I already have deferring this item, given the changes that we've had and information that's come forward in this afternoon. This is a planning amendment that's going to have an impact for a very long time, and I believe that we need the clarification and to get this tight and right in order to have the best outcome possible.
So only the mover.
Yeah, for this type of procedural motion.
Sure. No, okay. There is no debate. I put the procedural motion to...
We can't oppose it? Speak in opposition?
You can vote against it, Councillor
We
Riccielli. You
speak in
can't speak.
opposition.
There's only the mover. Those, I put the motion, those in favour? Motion is carried. 5-4. To defer until the meeting of the 27th of October. Okay. A lot to get your head around. Councillors, item 13.2. Alternative recommendation from Councillor Riccelli. Councillor Riccelli, would you like to move your alternative recommendation?
Yes, thank you, Mr Mayor. I'd like to move my recommendation as written.
That is to defer this item until the
Till the
ordinary council
24th
meeting
of-
on the 24th of November.
That's correct.
Is there a seconder? There is. Is there opposition? There is. If you would like to move your motion, Councillor Riccelli. There is opposition. Sorry, whose seconder was Councillor Carter? Sorry.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. It's clear from recent community access sessions and obviously from tonight that small holdings and larger holdings within the zone have some very reasonable concerns over the proposed modifications to the zoning table. I particularly took on board the smaller commercial property concerns as it restricts the way in which the business can operate or be let. Whilst I appreciate the alternate officer's recommendation takes into account the concern around allowing office use for units 1 to 5 at 17 Busselton Highway, there may still yet to be identified other smaller businesses affected, and there may be other amendments to the modification to the zoning table that need to be considered, such as what we've heard tonight. So for these reasons, I would like this motion deferred to allow further briefings and further consideration on this matter. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Carter as seconder of the...
I reserve my right.
Thank you. Councillor Carter as speaker against the motion. Councillor Payne.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. The concern from the owner of one of the units on number 17 Busselton Highway has been addressed with an additional use right in section 1. The area itself, the subject of the scheme amendment, is not particularly large. So it's reasonable, I think, to say that it's very unlikely that there's unforeseen circumstances such as that one, the part in red in the alternative. If, though, there is an unforeseen circumstance, some use that is or could be appropriate, there is the process to go that we can utilise, which is a spot amendment to the scheme to create that additional use in the future, should it be necessary, which I find very unlikely. The concerns by Paul Cossoglo and Associates are probably not so much to do with the deferral itself. That's the substantive content of the amendment rather than anything that's happened recently. So it's been considered over a long period of time. So I would argue that at a later time.
That would be appropriate. Is there a speaker for? Speaker against? Councillor Carter, did you wish to exercise your right as seconder? Yes or no?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, my concern is equally about sort of at the last minute doing some spot rezoning, I suppose. And I just think we need to put a little bit more time into it. There was evidence indicated that some members of the community didn't receive any notification that that this process was going through, including Ms. Carroll. I just think that that it's important that we just confirm that there's no other areas that are going to be inadvertently affected. So yes, I support the deferral of this motion on that basis.
Councillor Riccelli, right of reply. Not sure that there was too much to reply to.
No, look, just quickly, I take on board Councillor Payne's points that the officers have obviously put an alternative through that addresses the unit, specifically 1 to 5, but I echo Councillor Carter in that I think there may be other identified parties that need to be considered with this, and it definitely needs some more discussion and consideration before we make this decision. Thank you.
Thank you. I close debate and put the motion. Those in favour of the recommendation? Opposed? It's carried 8-1. A bit of work to do. Councillors, we have been presented a report of a confidential nature in accordance with section 5.232A and B of the Local Government Act 1995. This report has been provided to councillors and the Chief Executive Officer only. In order to maintain the confidentiality of the item, I'll seek a decision to close the meeting to members of the public. Do I have a mover to close the meeting to the public? A mover, Councillor Cronin. Seconder, Councillor Carter. Is there any opposition? No, I'll put the motion. Those in favour? Carried 9-0. Are we streaming? Okay. The officer recommendation was that the council endorses the performance review letter at attachment A as an accurate reflection of the CEO's performance during the review period and endorses the revised KPIs as set out in the review letter at attachment A. It was carried 9-0. With that, I declare the meeting closed. The next ordinary council meeting will be held on the 27th of October. There will, however, be a special council meeting held on Monday, the 18th of October, to swear in the new councillors following the elections on the 16th of October, and to appoint councillors to the city's various committees and working groups. With that, I declare it closed. Thank you all for your attendance.